This is Alexa Linton, and you're listening to the Whole Horse Podcast. We're now in season 6. Thanks to all of you tuning in and sharing the podcast with your friends to keep the momentum going. This podcast is dedicated to all things horse and all things that uplift equine well-being and welfare. And I'm having down-to-earth conversations with equine professionals about the little things that move the dial slowly but surely towards a better world for horses. You'll find all the episodes, 93 and counting now, on iTunes, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcast. Thanks for being here and enjoy the ride. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Whole Horse Podcast. I'm here today with, again, someone I've been following on social media and just really curious about her work and the offerings that she is bringing, and just had to reach out to her and chat more. So I'm really excited to welcome Kathryn of Open Heart Horsemanship to the podcast. Welcome, Kathryn.
Thank you, Alexa. I'm so excited to be here. I have been listening to the Whole Horse Podcast for a while now, and so it was just such a thrill that you reached out to me. I'm really excited to be here.
Wonderful. Well, it is, mutual. The feeling is mutual. And right. And I originally found a post from you that I was really drawn to, which was around your program. I think you call it ritual. Was it ritual crafting for
barn and stable? Yeah.
Barn and stable. There we go.
Stable. Yeah.
Yes. And I remember seeing that being like, oh, okay. Like, I want to talk about ritual on here. I want to talk about ceremony, unpack some of both sides, like the really beautiful sides of that, and some of the maybe a little more uncomfortable, hard sides of that. And so very excited to be able to have that conversation with you here today. So before we begin, can you share a little bit about, let's say, how ritual came into your path? Like, where did ritual and horses kind of merge for you? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, gosh, I love that question, and it's that's a question that's been sort of inadvertently coming up for me a lot lately as I've been sharing about this class and as I've been talking, with my partner and with my family about it. It's something that a lot of people have asked me about in reference to my own work and my own spirituality as a practicing witch. And, I, quote, came out of the broom closet, as it were, about, 5 or 6 years ago, sort of in a way that was really the like, okay, I'm going to start talking about this and can't go back now sort of piece of it. But as I was talking, particularly in a conversation with my partner about it, I realized, since I was 7 years old, 8 years old, riding, every time my horse would spook, I would get off and I would put my hand on my heart and take some deep breaths, and I would put my hand on my horse's forehead, and we would just breathe together and have this okay, are you all right in your body? I'm all right in my body. We're good together. Okay, and then get back on and go. And that was something we did every single time he ever had any kind of an issue, or if I got nervous, and that became a ritual, and things like making your horse a little grain birthday cake on their birthday every year. That's a ritual, and so there are these things that I would do with my horses. Even, every time I'd go off on the trail by myself, my mom would, tell my horse, okay, you take care of my girl, and there were these ritualistic things we would do with our horses that didn't have to be these big elaborate things. But even getting down that road in this conversation I was having the other day, I was talking about, and gosh, I would make little pouches that had little crystals and, plants and flowers I found with, different intentions of how I wanted my ride to go. And I would clip those to my belt loop before every ride. And that wasn't something that at the time I saw as like a witchy ritual. It was just something I did, but it absolutely is something that falls very, very deeply into that category, and is something that now, if somebody were to say, how could I intertwine, witchcraft ritual and, horsemanship, that's a perfect example of it. And it was just something I intuitionally did at the time. It wasn't something that I sought out or, saw somewhere else and went, ooh, that's what witchy people do. I'm going to do that. right? And so I think a lot of what drives all of this to me is intuition, right? And that's where I think the accessibility piece of the conversation is really important. And that's accessibility in terms of access to resources, but also like mental accessibility, because I think so much of it seems really distant, or like if you have an established spiritual practice that, doesn't align with, paganism or witchcraft or things like that, oh, this isn't for me. When the reality is, if you can connect to your intuition, ritual can align with any spiritual practice, right? And it does. There are, opening presents on Christmas every year is a ritual, right? So redefining the relationship to ritual, I think, is something that is really important to me as well. And that the conversation around just because I identify as a witch doesn't mean someone else has to, in order to find this work or to be supported in their horsemanship with this work. And I think particularly with, clients who deal with a lot of fear, and insecurity and anxiety working with their horses, ritual is something that can be really, really helpful to externalize intention for times that we get sort of so wrapped up in our narrative about what's going on with our horse that we can kind of lose sight of our personal empowerment and the control that we have over the situation by how we bring our intention and our energy into it. And ritual is something that can allow us to reconnect with that by externalizing it when we feel like we don't have the internal resources to do it, just in our heads or in our hearts without bringing it into the world in front of us somehow. So hopefully that sort of answers that. I think there was a little bit more in there probably.
That is so perfect. And, I think I love hearing that this is something that probably all of us are doing to some degree, whether we know it or not. And that there are, when you, whatever it is, pick out your horse's feet or the way that you saddle up, or even I know for myself, it's like the way that I ask for a bridle to go on, and I'm careful about the ears and all of those things. It's like, there seems to be, I guess, this level of awareness, sort of a consciousness. And I guess it leads me into my next question of, how do we distinguish a ritual from, say, just an action?
Right, a routine, routine. Ritual versus routine, right? And to me, that comes back to intention, right? Because if we're just picking out our horse's feet every day and we're not really thinking about it or whatever, right? That's a routine. If we're thinking about our grocery list, or, even present with the horse, but we're just sort of doing it to do it because it's a chore, right? If we're doing it like it's a chore, then we don't have that intention behind it. But if, as we're picking out our horse's feet, we're imagining pulling out all of the negative energy that maybe the horse has picked up through spaces that it's walked in, right? And as we're picking out all the dirt, we're visualizing pulling out anything the horse wants to let go of that isn't serving it anymore. It becomes a ritual just in setting that intention. And so I think that piece too is something that's so important around the accessibility conversation. Like, you don't need to buy anything. You don't need to go tie a bunch of crystals to all your tack. You can, if that feels supportive, absolutely, and if you want to just have it come down to mindfulness and breath and intention, everybody has access to that.
I love that, because I think that what I'm hearing is that every action that you move through with your horses has the potential to contain more meaning and more care, and also something I think in our culture that is easily lost, which is more presence.
Yes.
As well. Yes. And acknowledging how horses, they live in this present moment. It's so essential to meet them there, as much as possible. It sounds to me like this opportunity for a ritual sort of is actually a connector. Is totally. That what you would say?
I would. And I also think that, a really valuable piece of what you're talking about is, so many people gravitate towards horses, particularly those of us who are going through challenging times or who have experienced, really, really deep, challenging times in the past in our lives. We come to horses because they bring us into the present, right? That's so much of what, when we look at the world of equine therapy and all of these different niches that exist out there, part of what draws us to horses and feels so spiritually powerful about them is the way that they bring us into the present moment. And they, in so many ways, demand presence from us. But so seldom do we really intentionally give that back to them, right? We come into that dynamic and we receive them bringing us into the present. But so seldom do we bring things energetically into the arrangement that allow them to come more into the present, them to meet us more. It becomes them consistently meeting us where we are at, and less us meeting them where they're at, and meeting in the middle, right? And so to me, this is one more way we can meet our horses in the middle that really doesn't require a ton from us other than thinking about our intentions and getting clear on what they might be. It doesn't require a big financial investment. It doesn't require going to school for a long time. All it really requires is thinking about what's in your heart and connecting to what you would like to offer your horse energetically in any given moment. And sometimes it can be what I would like to offer my horse energetically is us being mellow and kind of chilled out in each other's space. And it also, I want to stress that ritual doesn't lose its value if you only do it when the inspiration strikes, right? You don't have to move through a relationship with a horse constantly, turning every time you pick their hooves into a ritual, right? I don't. I am also a person, and sometimes I just need to pick the horse's feet or spray them with fly spray. Other times I'm spraying them with fly spray. I'm envisioning the fly spray creating a gold bubble of protection around them, right? But I don't do it every time, because sometimes it's just I'm there to be a person. And there are times too where if I come at the horse with that intention and I can feel like they just are not feeling it today, that's the other thing that's really important, I think, is learning to check in with our horse about, are they in a place where whatever piece of ritual we're wanting to craft aligns for them in any given moment, so that we're not just sort of bulldozing them, energetically and spiritually as well, because they are also their own individual beings that get to participate or not in all of those moments and all of those rituals.
So yeah, this sense of, is my horse a willing participant in this?
Right. Are they consenting?
Are they consenting?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes, they're new to it too, energetically, right? And so sometimes they'll be really curious and maybe they might be a little skeptical and they go, oh, what is that thing you're holding? Or what is that weird spray you're spraying? Or, whatever thing it might be that they're not sure, but then they feel, the energy or the intention shift and they go, ooh, this feels nice. Ooh, I like this a lot. Ooh, you can keep doing that. Are you going to do that again today? And the curiosity starts to peak and they become, just like people, more open-minded to something that was different at first. But we also, just the way we are with people who are new to these things, can't just come in and, force them into it because we feel really called, right? Especially if it's completely new to our dynamic. If this is something that is really, really non-traditional in your dynamic, and then we just start kind of going full bore at it, that's really exciting and inspiring and wonderful, but it can also be really a lot for our horses. And so we want to be mindful of, also the energetic relationship we've had up to a given point with them and how we can shift those things mindfully and in a way that's going to be accessible for them too.
So in this particular scenario, like I have ways that I check in around consent with body work and other work. And I'm always curious about, other people's kind of ways of doing this. For you, what does consent, permission, participation look like for you?
Yeah, gosh, there are so many different ways depending on whatever given thing I'm doing that are various kinds of checkpoints. And I think the thing to me that is so important, just like consent in any other space, consent is not just something we ask for at the beginning and then go, okay, now we have full permission and carte blanche to do whatever we want going forward, right? Consent is an ongoing conversation. And so I think being really clear about what our personal relationship to the concept of consent looks like as we move into offering that and asking that from our horses. There's the initial piece, right, of if a horse in their body language stiffens and goes to move away, or they're, not wanting to look at you and, they're giving you all of these body language cues that they don't want it. Or every time we go to sort of move towards them with something, they, shift their weight back, or they hold their breath, or they, their brow furrows or whatever it is, right? There's all these little things, but they can be really excited about something at first. And part of the nature of consent is it's not yes or no, right? It can be slow down, right? Slow down is a way of changing the conversation around consent. So there are things like, even when I'm doing energy work with a horse, sometimes they go, okay, I'm not quite ready for you to move on from this spot, or, that's a little too much energy. Can we like walk it back? Right. And sometimes it's not, I don't want you to do energy work on me. It's just, that's a little too strong. Can we bring the energy down? Right. And so I think understanding that within all of the concept of consent, there is that nuance, and really not only learning your own horse's unique cues, but getting truly comfortable with receiving whatever answer you're given, and realizing that not being comfortable with quite exactly the way we want something to go doesn't mean they don't want something at all. It doesn't mean, no, go away, don't look at me, I don't like you. It might just mean, can you go a little slower? Can we do this a little gentler? Or can I have more time to think about it? That's the other really big thing that I think in the conversation of consent with horses, we lose sight of really consistently. And that is, can I have more time to think about it? I think so frequently, one of the ways we put pressure on our horses, sometimes even in the positive reinforcement world, that the concept is there is no pressure, right? And that it's not pressure and release, is there's such a need for them to think about things quickly. And for horses who are slow to process, sometimes that's really challenging. And one of the pieces of feedback that I've heard with a lot of folks who, a lot of clients who go into something like positive reinforcement and say, oh, my horse just can't do it, is part of what's challenging is that their horse needs a lot of time to process, right? And there's an expectation that, if there's some kind of reward involved, or if there's no more pressure, then the horse should be able to get it quickly. And sometimes just our intention of that, come on, figure it out, is a way of applying pressure, and is in some ways, a form of emotional coercion with them. And so we need to be really accountable for the energy that we bring in to the conversation of consent with horses, in that there is sometimes just, they need more time, or they need more information or more context, the same way, that we might, if someone asks us if we want to do something or not, we might say, can I think about it a little longer? I want to see how the rest of my day goes, or I need more information. Who all's going to be there? Right. Mm-hmm. And even though horses don't think the way that we do in that cognitive sense, they absolutely can need more information in order to give, an honest and informed, empowered answer about something. And so that's a piece too that we, I think, owe our horses, that often is not really given to them.
Is such an important, that whole piece and that reminder, because I think, it's so easy to fall into this. Okay, I'm going this quick. Like,
I get it. Why don't you?
Yeah, exactly. Right. And, this sense, and I'm sure you felt this with your energy work as well. I know I have with body work, where the pauses are just as potent mm-hmm. as the sometimes actual more hands-on, right? Because that's the moment where integration comes in. There's a settling. The body can go, oh, that's different. Right. There's this pause space that allows all of that work that we just did to actually land in a system. Right.
Or it brings up discomfort with having to pause. That's one of the big things. I think so much information is available to us, and so much context is available to us in the pauses and in the breaths taken between, where, if that time and space and pausing and slowing down, or, practicing the art of doing nothing, whether we're talking about energy work, practical horsemanship, whatever it is, when those pauses are deeply, deeply uncomfortable and activating, either for the horse or for the person involved, that gives me a lot of context, and it leads me to a lot of the really important questions that get us to the depths of the work that we're really trying to accomplish, that in many cases is not actually the reason in the surface, that I was brought there, and is often sort of the thing that is identifiable maybe at first blush, but then over time, as we get deeper and deeper into it, and we sort of start asking, well, why are we doing what we're doing? Or why is this thing important to us? Why is being able to accomplish this goal important to us? And we start to get into that, and we go, okay, well, where are some of the difficulties coming up? And often the difficulties come up in things happening too fast and needing to slow down, and sitting with the discomfort of going slow. And this was something actually even in our ritual crafting class we were talking about last night, is this concept of slower than slow and then slower than that. And that if we're getting so slow that we're starting to feel antsy, we need to slow down more. right? Because there's something in that there's still some unaddressed pressure. If we're starting to feel like we're crawling out of our skin because things are so slow and we're feeling impatient, there's something missing in the foundation of that we need to go in and look at and find. And we need to dig deeper until we can find the thing, identify it, and go, oh, okay, this is what it is. All right, now we can look the thing in the face and sit with it. And there's oxygen to have a conversation about whatever is really going on here, rather than the sort of deflection of, I just want to keep going. Or are we going slow enough yet? Why isn't anything happening?
Yeah.
Right. So I think these are all really important pieces. And even, through our ritual crafting class, these are a lot of the conversations that we're having. Like, yes, there are these very practical tools about how to craft different kinds of rituals and, how to really bring them into an externalized practice of, if we're wanting to bring in candles and herbs and, different kinds of intentional physical practices. But what are the intentions behind them, and how do we get clear on those things? And these are all conversations that need to be had in order to get clear on what our intentions are to even do any of these rituals, right? Because it doesn't matter if you buy, a chime candle in every color or every herb under the sun to do rituals with, or have every crystal you can think of. If we don't know why we're doing what we're doing and we don't have an intention in our heart, it really isn't going to help us very much.
I love that. As a classically fast-paced human,
yeah,
been categorized as a hummingbird sometimes. This that sense of slowing down more than that. I've really seen it in my work with my horses, and in particularly my older mare, who's we've been together 20 years coming up next month. And I was with her through those times where slowing down was like really challenging for me. Right. And I had just goals, like we have stuff to get done,
right.
And so the sense now that I'm seeing in her nervous system, and that I've been progressively doing more work with, is she just starts throwing answers at me.
Right.
Right. So we'll be hanging out and just standing. And then she's like, okay, so do you want this? Like, right. Should I do this? What about, would this work for you? Like, what do you think about that? And even though I'm just like, no, we're just chilling. And she's like, I'm not, I don't know if I'm okay with that. Like,
right. I'm so used to something needing to happen. Right. I'm so used to something needing to happen that, I'm just going to offer you things until you do something about it, because usually something is supposed to happen. And so I'm just going to keep trying stuff until something happens.
Totally. And the pattern is that I'm normally in that space. Okay, we're going to go do stuff,
Right.
And here, okay, we'll do this and we'll do that and we'll do this. And this sense of, wow, it's almost equally challenging.
Right.
For her to slow down as for me to slow down at this point, right?
Right. Because it's so often, that's really at the core of what I teach and talk about, both around the concept of, the art of doing nothing, which is not a term that I've coined, but is absolutely something that within horsemanship, is at the core of what I teach, this concept of, you can be a Grand Prix competition rider. And if you're not able to sit comfortably, counting your breaths with your horse and aligning your heartbeat with your horse and feel just as fulfilled doing that, that's going to tell you where all your blind spots are, and nothing shows us our blind spots with our horses and our relationship with them and where our sort of shared hurdles and obstacles are, like slowing down and trying to not do anything and trying to, and it doesn't even have to be, this concept of like sit in silence, clear your mind, chant Om over and over again kind of thing. But the idea of, can I just focus on syncing my breath with my horse's breath? And often what we'll see when we do something like that is the horse will start out really far away from us, or they'll come kind of check us out and be maybe a little bit more in our space than we'd like. And then when they realize we're not going to go do something, they kind of go, okay, this is weird. And they go away. And then the more we drop in with them and the more we, notice their breaths and sync our breaths up with it, or we, notice their heartbeat and sync up our heartbeat, the more they will sort of blend their energy in with ours, and the more they'll kind of come into our space. And they come in really differently than at first when they're sort of all over us and go, do you have food? Are we going to go do something? What are we doing? Right? Where they'll just come and do something like quietly rest their muzzle on your head, or something like that. And just, they get this like, oh, okay, we're dropping into this place now. All right. And it's like they kind of step into that, that experience of their being right the same way that we do. And oftentimes it requires us being able to access that for them to go, okay, this is a safe person for me to go to this place with. And if there are hurdles to that, that's the space where it's going to come up, right? It doesn't matter how perfectly you can send your horse over a jump course. The things that are going to be making going over that jump course difficult in the relationship are what's going to come up in trying to sit and do nothing with your horse. So there's that piece. And there's also along the piece of what you're talking about with, the horse getting kind of antsy and uncomfortable with all of that. That is the shared experience of doing shadow work with our horses, right? And this idea of, they're bringing their own stuff to the table too, as a fully realized individual. And particularly if they're a horse that we've rescued later in life and they've lived a whole experience that maybe didn't have so many great things in it, or had one big bad thing going on. They've got their own experiences that inform who they are in the relationship. Their function is not just as a mirror to us, right? They also have their own stuff that they're bringing. And often we gravitate, just like we do in romantic partnerships and friend partnerships, we gravitate towards people who activate our stuff, right? And that give us an opportunity to be triggered so we can work on it, hopefully in an environment that is safe and different from wherever we maybe originally received that patterning. And the same is true of our relationships with our horses. And so often we will trigger each other, right? And part of that is the point, right, of being able to build these relationships and do this work. And so that's also useful information, right? And so often we see people looking at the pieces that are triggering either for their horse or for themselves in the relationship, and they go, either this is why I need a different horse, or if I had a different horse, this wouldn't be happening, or I just need to figure out how to make this behavior stop so that I can get my horse back, or I can get back to the thing we really like doing. And there is sort of a missing of the point that mutual triggering that's happening is the purpose of the relationship, right? And it might be you bought a horse because you want to go have fun on the trail and do all those things, or you want to go show or whatever it is. But the point of like connecting in a soul relationship with this other sentient being is to work through the stuff, right? Just like in any other relationship we have, the point is to be able to go through, the dark and light together, the good times and the bad times. And it's really only in our relationships with our horses that we have so normalized this, like, oh, they're bucking. What can I do to get them to stop bucking? Or, suddenly they're trying to nip me every time I put the halter on. How do I make them stop doing that? Not, what is this telling me about our relationship, right? And often if we come to it with the intention of what is this telling me about our relationship, we can, in the biggest of air quotes, solve the problem faster, in that we can get to the truth of what's going on and we can have an authentic moment of growth to work through it, or many moments of growth to work through it, rather than sort of going, okay, I need a different saddle, or I need a different bit, or I need to, outsource the change somehow to make the problem go away, rather than looking within into ourselves and into the relationship with the horse, or holding space for the horse to be saying, I'm not happy about something in our relationship. There is something that needs to change here. And maybe it's something that we think as the person is totally fine, but it doesn't make the horse happy anymore. I look at, like, I competitively show jumped with my horse for years. And that was something that I had a lot of fun doing. But there was a point where he very clearly told me, okay, this isn't fun anymore. And when I realized that, it wasn't fun for me anymore either, right? It's not fun for anybody to make a horse do something they don't like doing and that isn't fun for them. And sometimes there is that misalignment of, gosh, this is something I've really been enjoying, but my horse doesn't like it anymore. And the reality is, like, the horse isn't obligated to like something just because we enjoy it, right? And they get to move through seasons just like we do. And if we were, say barrel racing, or, doing dressage or whatever it is, if we were involved in a discipline that we really liked for years, and then we decided, gosh, I'd really like to try this other discipline. I don't think I'm that interested in this one anymore. We'd never give it a second thought. But when our horses decide, I don't want to do this anymore, and maybe they'd like to try something else, it's seen as like, this horse is no good for this anymore. We need to sell it and buy another one that is good for this discipline. And not like, wow, let's see where your creativity is going to take this relationship, right? We're totally willing to let the relationship be driven by our creativity and our interest in that way. And so seldom do we give that to our horses. And so I think that's another piece too that is really valuable in the conversation around when the horse starts to sort of get activated in the ways that we do. That sometimes there are difficult questions that maybe we don't want to hear the answers to. And usually those are the ones we need to be asking.
Yeah. Yeah. And the word that's coming to mind, it's a bit cliche, but this sense of like, rather than, okay, I'm creating the path and my horse better come along with me for that ride or else.
Right.
Then the sense of the co-creation. Okay. So here we are. And I think for some people, it's this deeper dive into, do I truly consider my horse to be a sentient being,
right,
with valuable opinions
and an equal,
and right, all of those things? Or am I playing lip service to that because, it's the right thing to do and say, right? Like, oh yeah, I get that. But at my core, in all those, say, inherited little spaces that for so long in our ancestry believed that horses were a beast of burden, were there to serve us, all these things. Have I done that?
Right. And the answer is always yes. I mean, I think that's the thing, right? The answer is always yes. We've all internalized that. I mean, that was basically the subject of our ritual crafting class last night was, releasing shame and comparison, but also a piece of that came around releasing judgment, right? When other people are not as far into their journeys of honoring the horse and being in that sort of authentically equal partnership with the horse, right? And the thing that was at the epicenter of that conversation was connecting to the little horse kid that fell in love with this and connecting to why we wanted to do this in the first place. And does our inner little horse kid have anything to say about how they like or don't like our current relationship with our horse, and what would they change, and what's their favorite thing to do with our horse and what's their least favorite thing to do? And then when we're watching someone else maybe do something that we don't think is fair to a horse, to look at that person and go, how do I think they're speaking to their inner little horse kid right now? And how can I show up with them with curiosity in a way that's going to be supportive to their inner little horse kid that maybe they as an adult are not being so supportive of in this moment with their horse, right? And that allows us to really release so much of the shame, comparison, the judgment, all of those things in a way that really this industry is kind of built on hoping we don't figure out how to do, and we talked about even just going on social media, walking into a tack shop, any of those things. Even if you have your horse at home on your own property and no one ever sees you with them, or you never see what anyone else does, being a human existing in the world and needing to just go buy more hay for your horse is something that puts us in a part of the world where we see what other people are doing and are made to question, am I doing the right thing? Or we see what other people are doing and go, gosh, how could they ever do that? Right. And so much ancestral sort of shame, comparison, judgment, guilt, all of these things are built into this industry that in order to really, really get deep into this path of inner work with our horses, we have to be willing to question these things. And we have to be willing to realize that it's not a one-time conversation we have with ourselves, and it's not something we identify once and then go, okay, this is in me. We have to be willing to every time we go to the barn and we're disappointed because we wanted to ride and our horse doesn't, that we ask ourselves, well, what was it that I was hoping to get out of riding? And why do I feel like I can only get that out of riding? And, why am I having the feelings I'm feeling towards my horse about the fact that they don't want to? And where do those beliefs come from? And, what part of me is feeling this because I would have gotten in trouble as a little kid if I was in a group lesson and I said, my pony doesn't want to ride anymore and I'm going to leave, right? Like that's something that is so seldom ever accepted. And so really questioning, I think, the part of us that exists in terms of why we got into it, right? And even if we came to it as an adult and we didn't have the experience of being, a child and, the little horse kid piece of us, it's all in there for all of us somewhere, and the part of us that is the most full of wonder in how we connect to our horses is that piece. And so for many of us, that is the little horse kid. And, you know, for some of us, it's the little horse kid that we never got to be. And the conversation that we're having with that little person inside of us is the little person that we wanted to get to be and didn't get to be. And what is that person saying in this moment? You know, and so it's being able to check in with a lot of these things that, you know, very quickly there can be the feedback of like, well, we're having a conversation about horses. Why are we talking about inner child? And the reality is like the inner child's riding our horse or standing in front of our horse just as much as we are, if not more, a lot of the time.
On that piece, I just love that. I have had this realization over, especially I had a really bad health event last year. And especially since then, I've been really having the work for me is actually being with a fear of horses is what I'm noticing. And it's really even hard to like admit that here, I find.
Right.
Because it's like, oh, you do a horse podcast and you do all the things. And yes, there is this anxiety, nervousness for me that has been arising, particularly as my body is not as bouncy and as, you know, as strong as it once was. And yeah, it's been fascinating to be with that place and remembering back to that little child, Alexa, who, you know, first fell off a pony because he was really round and his saddle just went doop, 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 doop. And, you know, and it but, you know, unfortunately had me being dragged on the ground for a little while in a really scary way. And these places where, you know, I was, shall I call it, fairly self-destructive for, you know, into my 20s, I would say. And so I got into a lot of trouble, like wrecks in terms of horses. Like I would put myself in scenarios where I didn't really have a good sense of safety or what was safe for me. And I would sort of push myself over edges. And so, yeah, it feels like, I guess the chickens are coming home to roost a little bit. And it's been this fascinating experience of what does it look like to be with my anxiety and fear in a really supportive, healing, soothing way. And with that little child as well, what does she need to start to really come back to the sense of awe and wonder and connection, right? And confidence, I suppose. Right?
Yeah, that's a lot of it too. And, you know, it's, I think so much of where that childlike confidence, of course, comes from that not knowing what we don't know piece, of course. But then there's also, I think, the piece about like, you know, you look at times where a kid is in a lesson scenario and maybe they unexpectedly cue the horse to canter and they've never cantered before. And we're sitting there as the adult. And, you know, of course, sometimes for kids that can be really, really scary. And then there's these kids who they do that and they're laughing and they go again, can I do it again? And we're going, oh my God, thought you were going to fall off, you know, or I thought you like something bad was going to happen, or we're scared for them. Right. And they're going, you know, this is amazing. Right. And part of that is maybe that they've never come off before and they don't know the consequences. But I think so much of it is that they're just present with the horse. And it was, you know, it felt like the horse was having fun and I was having fun, and that's what mattered. And, you know, I trust the horse and it feels like the horse trusts me. And there is this sort of purity of intention, right? And I'm always really careful with the word purity because there's so much culturally wrapped up in that. But purity and alignment of intention, you know, and we can have, you know, purity of intention even in like deep dark shadow work that we're doing, right? It doesn't have any kind of connotation in this context around the nature of the intention so much as it is really just a form of alignment, you know. And I think that when we see that little inner child that wants to get back to, for so many of us, you know, it used to be so fun when I was a kid, and why isn't it like that anymore, right? So much of it is because when we are working with our horse, there's part of us that's, you know, going, okay, is anybody looking at me and criticizing me, or am I doing that well enough compared to the other person? And I mean, even again, last night when I was teaching, part of the conversation was around in, you know, teaching scenarios, even if it's not a group lesson. How many of us have been riding with a trainer who says, now watch that person over there, see what they're doing, you should be doing it more like that, right? or here's the thing about you that isn't like them and that you should wish was like that, especially if it's something about us that we can't really change very easily, right? And as somebody with a lot of like physiological disability related issues, that's something that's been definitely a big piece of my growth, in terms of relating to, my inner little horse girl that went through a lot of like, watch that person and do what that person does, where like physically my body couldn't, right? And so there is so much of the way we are taught to relate, particularly as children, but even as adults, that we are taught to relate when we're learning to ride or we're learning to be with horses, that is, watch that other person who's doing it better than you, and yes, that can be a valuable teaching tool to a point, but also I think, the greatest teachers out there are the ones that don't need you to compare yourself to anyone else. They can simply help you understand what about whatever it is that you're doing needs to change or shift somehow without outsourcing it to just look at that person, right? And so I think that's also something that is sort of intertwined with a lot of the conversation, is the way that, teaching happens in this industry, and the sort of symptom of everything you're talking about the generational sort of misuse and abuse of horses, and really the use of them as tools for fun, for labor, for competition, for whatever it is, rather than the seeing of them as sentient individuals. And part of that even kind of trickles out in how we teach, right? And if we're going, hey, look at how that person's riding over there, we're also not teaching the person to be with the horse they're on, right? Because we don't ride any two horses the same. So looking at someone else and how they're doing it on another horse really shouldn't even matter to begin with, because they're not on the horse your student is sitting on. And so even those pieces really intertwine with all of this conversation, which again, if we don't explore these things, ritual really has no purpose or function in any of it. If we're not super aware of where we fall within these things, and it doesn't mean we have to have the answers to these questions, but we have to know, okay, so if there are things that we don't have the answers to yet, how does my body feel when I ask that question? How would I like it to feel instead? There's maybe where I can start with my ritual practice, right? But if we're just not asking these questions at all, and it's, I want to have a better ride, I'm going to light a candle to have a better ride, like that, there's really nothing there for that, and the intention is fine, I suppose, but, and I certainly don't want to say necessarily what anyone can or can't do, but to me and so many of the wonderful teachers that I've had the privilege of working with and observing in the ritual space, the point of it is intention. It is in many ways no different than any other form of prayer that someone might engage in. The point is or meditation, it is one of the ways I've talked about ritual to folks who, are uncomfortable with it or unsure about it, is that to me, it is in many ways a more physically externalized form of guided meditation, right? It is figuring out, where am I right now? And how would I like that to either be different or stay the same? And then these are the steps or actions I'm going to take. And then, the intentions I'm going to put out into the universe and let them do what they will, right? I'm going to put the intention out there and then I'm going to let it go, and I'm just going to move forward and, be in my life having gotten clear about that intention, the same way that if somebody says, I'm going to pray on that or I'm going to meditate on that, there's really not a ton that's any different. But if we say something like, I'm going to pray I have a better ride today, that feels like kind of a throwaway statement. It doesn't really feel, let's pray I don't fall off, right? Like there's nothing of substance really there that we're talking about. But if right before we get on, we think, please let me be connected with my horse. Let me understand my horse and communicate clearly, and let me know when and where to hold my boundaries as I move through this ride today, right? That's a prayer, right? But let me just pray I don't fall off is just sort of a tongue-in-cheek, it's almost a little self-deprecating too. So I think to me, that's really where the delineation comes, and even brings us really back to the conversation of accessibility, for folks too.
Yeah. I love that clarity, I suppose, in terms of intention. And this sense of, earlier you spoke about the sense of, this is an opportunity to connect to your heart. And I think that really rings true to me here, is what is true in my heart. And I mean, there's a bigger question there. If we back up, I think for a lot of people is like, how the heck do I connect to what is true in my heart?
Right.
You know?
Right.
Because that
Right.
almost feels, I think we live in a culture where we are purposely disconnected from
absolutely
this, you know, shall we call it heart sense or sense of knowing that
disconnected from our intuition, really.
Intuition, whether we call it the soul, the, you know, our spirit self, you know, we think of, I've often thought of the heart, and I think this is talked about in many books, but like as the seat of the soul, right? The sense of, okay, how do I connect to that? What does that look like? So would love to hear if you have any offerings or any practices that you use to help to connect people into that space.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a couple of different things, you know, in various contexts that I sort of go into about it. You know, of course, I mentioned a little bit when we're talking about working with, you know, our inner little horse kid, you know, asking them, you know, even in the concept of like a journaling practice, you know, and sitting in our pasture and, you know, journaling what is my inner child's favorite thing about my relationship with my horse, and what is their least favorite thing, you know, and that can be a good place to start. You know, what feels good to me being with my horse and what doesn't feel good, you know, is something that can be a part of it. And if we sit down, you know, in the pasture and we have our journal and we go, I don't know what to write about that. Write about how frustrating it is to not know what to write about. Write about how frustrating it is to feel disconnected and to feel like we can't connect to our heart center, right? Start by naming it. You know, that is, I think, the most important thing, regardless of whatever practice we are embarking on, is to start by naming it. And particularly in terms of connecting to the horse too, you know, if we're not naming how we're feeling authentically in any given moment, that's going to be a major source of disconnect with the horse. But then if we're talking about something like, you know, in the moment, particularly with anyone who's experiencing fear, that's where I've talked a lot about things like bilateral stimulation and body scanning are physiological tools we can use, right? Because if we're not in our body, if we're dissociated and we're in a, you know, fight or flight moment, it's going to be really hard to check in with our heart, right? Or come back to our heart center if we're not even in our body, right? Or if we don't even know if we're in our body or not, right? Sometimes the dissociation can be so powerful that we can't even tell really that we're dissociated. And so that's where, you know, techniques like in your boots, especially if you're on your horse, you know, if you get on a horse and immediately your blood pressure spikes and your heart rate goes up and you're going, oh my God, you know, and like you're fine on the ground and then you get on the horse and, you know, the world around you kind of does that like womp womp thing and you're, oh no. That's where, you know, things like scrunching up your toes on opposite sides in your boots, you know, rolling one ankle, then rolling the other, knocking one knee, then knocking the other, you know, all the way up your body, throwing your weight into one hip, then into the other. And doing this through your whole body, this one side, then the other. You know, one of the pieces I was talking about as I was teaching last night is that a really great tool, especially if we're in a social situation at the barn and we're starting to get activated, is that like scrunching your toes in your boots in opposite timing, you know, or squeezing your fist. Something you can even do like loosely with the reins, just the way you'd half halt, you know, and just don't do it when you've got, you know, contact taken up on your reins. But if you have a loose rein and you're just squeezing your fists back and forth, you know, that's something that what it does is it teaches, or it tells each hemisphere of your brain to talk to each other, which is what stops happening when we go into fight or flight. And so it helps us sort of mechanically bring our brain back and forth. I've heard it talked about that we also need to be like touching opposite sides of our body when we're doing it. That's something that I think, you know, I've heard pretty significant contrasting feedback about that from various clinicians that I've spoken to. It typically tends to be something that I don't teach it that way because usually when I'm teaching that practice, somebody is on or holding a horse and they're dealing with fear. And so doing something like having two reins in our hands and squeezing both of our fists and then also tapping opposite side, it's too much stuff going on and it starts to become a safety concern. So there's also the conversation around modifying things for safety and all of that. But even things like connecting to our heart by, you know, envisioning, one of the practices I talked about is what I like to call the spider web practice, when we're getting into our car to go to the barn and we envision the whole driver's seat sort of opening space having a big spider web that pulls off of us anything that we don't want to take with us on our journey, or that as we're getting out of the car at the barn pulls off of us anything we don't want to take with us, right? And that we don't want to give to our horses. And we don't even have to really have identified what those things are. But oftentimes doing these practices kind of brings them up. What about today do I want to leave behind? And then when we have those opportunities to think, what about today do I not want to bring into my horse's space with me? And we can even do that spiderweb practice on the threshold of the horse's stall or pasture, right? And asking the deeper question, well, what about this thing I'm leaving behind do I not want to bring in, and why? What about it makes me not feel good, right? How do I feel in my body when that thing happens? And how would I like to feel instead? And those are the kinds of questions that we can sort of ask ourselves to get curious about it. And even with things like intuition, one of the big places that this comes up in my work is around herbs. And someone will say, gosh, I'm really called to mugwort, but I have no idea why. And so it probably doesn't mean anything because I'm not an herbalist and I don't know. And they'll go on this whole thing. And we'll talk about, well, why are you called to mugwort? Oh, well, I really like the name. Well, what does the name bring up for you? How do you feel when you say the name? And they'll say, oh, it sounds mystical and it sounds, different and sort of ancient and historical. Okay. Do you like that it connects you to a feeling of like deep ancestral inner knowing? Yes, I like that. Okay, great. And we start, following the thread and continuing to ask ourselves these questions. And I really think that at the depths of it, whatever practice we go about, the thing that makes it effective for that connecting to our intuition, our higher self, our heart center, all of these things, is continuing to, go down that rabbit hole, follow the energy, right? That's something that my Reiki mentor talked a lot about, is the concept of follow the energy.
Yep.
And wherever that internal conversation goes, it's where it's meant to go. And you've got to keep following, the little breadcrumbs of that to lead you to wherever it is you're supposed to go. And I think oftentimes people are not comfortable with that, or there's even a feeling of like, well, I was really taught to not, spend too much time thinking about myself, and that it's maybe it's too self-involved to be thinking about, I don't like thinking about myself, that much. And that's, totally a valid thing to have, in our emotional backpack of stuff that we're bringing with us. And that's another really good place to start. If we don't like asking these questions, what about it makes them uncomfortable? How do we feel in our body when we ask ourselves these questions? And kind of coming back to that somatic piece is always a really good sort of guiding North Star as well.
Wonderful. I know we're hitting on things because you can see me over here yawning.
Yes, I know that movement of energy is always so indicative in the body with us and with our horses too.
Interesting. Yes. Don't know what it was, but I'll go with it.
Yeah.
So it's kind of neat. There you go, everybody. So I, in particular, release like horses do, and I yawn a lot.
Yep,
so
I do too.
You may have that as a thing, or other things. So that is really amazing. I wanted to, before we complete today, broach a bit of a controversial topic, and especially one when we're talking about ritual that I feel is important to bring up. And that to have a conversation about. So that topic is around cultural appropriation and ritual, because these two worlds can overlap very easily.
Right.
And I just wanted to get your sense on how you work with this and where that shows up for you.
Right. So I love that question, because that's something that comes up a lot, in my work as a brick and mortar herbalist, outside of the horse world as well. And that's something that comes up a lot because, for example, the shop that I work in sells white sage, and we purchase it from indigenous farmers who make their living selling it. That is something that they want to have happen, right? And we're directly interfacing with those people and supporting them through their work doing that, right? And the money goes directly back to them, and that's something that is done really ethically in that regard. And so in terms of things like the conversation around using, closed or protected items like white sage, my own personal practice is something where, with something like a material of that nature, I don't ever use white sage that I don't purchase it. Yeah. I happen to have a close family friend who is a really wonderful indigenous artist who grows his own white sage, and who gifts it to me on a sort of regular basis. And so I use that because it is a meaningful, spiritual gift that he gives me. But I don't personally purchase Palo Santo. It's something that, is really important to me, particularly because if it's anything like that I don't have a cultural connection to personally, right? there is the connection that is so beautiful of someone like my friend, this artist, gifting me a piece of his spiritually cleansing and protective culture and saying, I would like to gift this to you and share it with you. That's very different to me than me going to a store and buying it, right? And so it's actually something that I explicitly talk about in my ritual crafting for barn and stable class, where I'm giving, when I give the list of materials, I talk about using things like juniper and cedar or garden sage, which is a perfectly lovely alternative. And that within all of this, it brings me back to the conversation of intention with these, items, for example, that are really commonly appropriated and misused, that for folks who really don't have any business using them, the thing that makes them feel desirable to those folks is the intention that we give it, right? The meaning that we ascribe to the white sage versus the culinary sage. And, to me, the culinary sage has just as much meaning to protect us if we decide that it does. And the reality is that culturally growing culinary sage is often a lot more linked for those of us who want to be and shouldn't, in my view, be going out and purchasing white sage, right? And so I think that's also a really big piece of it. There's the piece around things like archetypal energy work, which is something that I teach a lot, and that works with the concept of archetypes of the human experience as they relate to different faces of, or gods and goddesses from different pantheons. I personally only work with archetypes that either connect to my personal spiritual heritage or heritage that I was raised with. So for example, I work with a lot of Greek archetypes, and my grandfather was Greek by adoption, but I was raised with that culture. And so that's something that is part of who I am, even though it's not in my DNA. And so I think that, and granted, this is not something that I hold any separate, it's social education on. It's not something I have a degree in. And so I want to be aware of the fact that, I'm so grateful that you're asking me these questions. And also, I am not an expert on these things. This is more, the feedback I'm giving is more around my personal practice and how I actively, intentionally stay connected to the pieces of ritual-based practice that I have a connection to, not just something I like that I see out there, right? And I think that's a big piece of it, is that folks go, well, I admire it so much, or I respect it so much, and so I want to do that. Or something feels like it holds more power to them because it is of a different cultural background. And I think that that's where a lot of the danger zone kind of starts to exist, right, within this stuff, is these things feel more powerful because they are a reflection of our otherization of people who are, don't share the same cultural background as we do, that gets, can be rooted in, some inadvertent racism and some inadvertent, really difficult beliefs, right? Of like, truly, why to me does it feel like my home won't be as protected unless I use white sage or Palo Santo as it will if I use the, cedar from the tree that grows in my yard, right? Or juniper from the tree that grows on, on my property, right? And also within that too is honoring the land that we're on, right? And honoring the fact that even if we live on a property that our family has owned for, 100 years, hundreds or more years, it is still not our land, right? And we are guests on it, and having nothing to do, to me, with even anything about our cultural heritage, or race, but just having to do with the fact that the earth is also its own being, and that we are also a guest on this planet and in nature, and that nature doesn't owe us anything is a really big piece of that for me. Now, granted, I think there is within all of that significant value in putting intention towards honoring the fact that, we're on stolen land if we're in most places in the Western United States, really Canada. All places, and Canada. Yeah. And so, there's a piece of that I think is really important. But to me, what I come back to in terms of kind of keeping my eyes on my own paper and staying in my own lane in terms of my spirituality is, rather than spending a whole lot of time getting really worried about over advocating for groups that I'm, not a part of, it's finding resources that I can refer people to from those educators who make it their life's work to teach about this, rather than teaching about something that I don't know, and using the practices that I do to help people connect with what's true to their heritage. So, say we're of, Scotch Irish descent. Were there juniper trees where your family came from? Were there hawthorn trees where your family came from? Maybe burn that, for cleansing, right? Connect who you are, where you come from. Or if you don't know, or you don't want to know, look at the land your horse is on. Is there plant material you can ethically harvest to, burn or work with that's on the land your horse is on, to connect with them, right? In my case, there's some horehound that grows outside of my horse's pasture, and that's something that I've harvested and put on an altar on a couple of occasions, just because it makes me feel close to my horse. And sometimes that's the reason. So I think the other piece too is getting, again, really clear on why we're doing what we're doing, and if someone else's connection to it is what makes it feel powerful for us. I think that's a pretty big red flag. And asking if it feels like, well, I just feel really connected to the energy of something like white sage, which is an example I continue to come back to because I think it's one of the most kind of topical ones. I just feel really connected to it. Well, okay, what makes you feel connected to it? Why do you feel connected to it? Is it because you've been told that it is the most powerful cleansing, herb that you can find out there? Is it because you grew up somewhere that has a lot of that growing? You probably then grew up somewhere that has a lot of other things growing too that might be, more ethical to use. And so I think that that's a really big piece of it for me, and particularly even in things like I look at honoring, our horse's ancestors. If we don't know about our own background, right? Because that's something that within a lot of this kind of work that I've done, I have talked with people who go, either I'm adopted and I don't really know anything about my background and where I come from, and I don't really care to. So does that mean I just don't get to do this work? And the answer is not at all. It's, it's for everyone. How can you connect to the land you live on now and honor the land you live on now? And how can you look at your horse's ancestry? I spend so much time, I have a Canadian horse.
Me too.
And wonderful. And they have such,
they're probably related.
Rich history. They probably are. They probably are. And, they have an incredible rich history, particularly their history with humans. And so when I'm working with him and I'm doing ritual, calling in his ancestors who, went into battle scenarios with their humans, right? And who had these, relationships that had to have had a lot of trust, right? If you're riding into war with a horse, there's so much mutual trust that has to happen there, which is not at all to say that the practices used back then to train war horses were ones that I at all agree with. But there is a point where, there's that bonding nonetheless that exists, and looking at those horses and asking them to watch over my horse, and things like that, and connecting with them. And how can I honor your legacy and give you, my horse's ancestors, what you were not given in how I show up for my horse? There's a whole question there. How can I connect with my horse, maybe by honoring pieces of nature from the parts of the world that my horse's ancestors are from, right? And so again, it comes back to intention, right? Because, both of my horses are from parts of the world that are not where I'm from. And if I'm using things, in my rituals that are to honor them in those ways, the point is not, I feel like I have a claim to it, right? This is representative of their heritage and their growth. And it's bringing them into the ritual as their own being with their own history that doesn't have to be exactly like mine, right? And so I think it is a really big, complicated conversation that, of course, I am not an educator on, but it is something that I'm really, really devoted to having absolutely at the forefront of the conversation around ritual, particularly, given all of the conversations around accessibility and the lack thereof in the horse world in general, and that there is a very, very clear demographic for whom the horse world is accessible and many demographics for whom it is not, including those with disabilities. And that's something too that is really important to me in in ritual is using ritual as a way to connect to our horses when maybe our bodies are not as capable as someone who is fully abled, and using that as a way to create a seat at the table for ourselves when there are other pieces that maybe aren't as accessible. You know, if my friends are going on a 6-hour trail ride and they invite me, I would love to go. And if I do, I'm probably not going to be able to get out of bed for a week. And I also may not on most days even be able to consider doing something like that. You know, even an hour trail ride on a lot of days is something that's not possible. Sometimes I drive to the barn and get out and go, oh, I can't do this at all today, actually, right? And a way to make horsemanship accessible to me when my body is giving up and says, this is not for you today, is to do something like, you know, a ritual with my horse, right? That's a really, really big piece of what brought me to this is, and I realize this kind of moves away from the conversation a little bit of appropriation, but I think accessibility is central to that conversation as well. And part of what is so important to me about the conversation around appropriation is that we are not taking from people who do not have the access to horses and horsemanship that we do as a way to deepen our relationship with our horses, right? Because I think that that's something that is so specific to appropriation as it shows up in ritual with horses, you know, and within this specific topic and conversation is we don't want to take from those who already struggle to have the accessibility within this industry that we do as a way to leverage deepen connection with our horses, right? That's something that is never okay. And so that's kind of the piece that I would like to leave that on.
I love that. That's, so essential to name. And I feel like this is the beginning of future conversations because this is a much
and
bigger
hopefully
topic.
With folks far more educated, you know, I'm also conscious of the fact that I am a cis white woman with, you know, little to no real position to be talking about this other than that it is central to the work that I teach separate from that conversation. And so, you know, I would be thrilled to listen to the future episodes, you know, hopefully with folks who are a lot more qualified to speak on this than I am.
Wonderful. Well, this has been a brilliant conversation. Thank you so much, Kathryn.
Thank you.
How do people get in touch with you?
Gosh, so my website, openhearthorsemanship.com, is a place you can go to explore some of my different offerings. There's a pretty diverse selection of things that I do. And so that's a really good place to start to kind of figure out what exactly might be the best way that we can support each other in working together. And then from there, my preferred way is emailing me info@openhearthorsemanship.com is great. You can also follow me on Instagram @openhearthorsemanship and DM me there as well. Those are my preferred methods.
Wonderful. That's great. Well, thank you again.
Thank you, Alexa.
And thanks for everybody who is listening in today. I hope you learned a thing or two. I know I did, and definitely released some things too. So maybe you did as well. All right. Wishing you all a wonderful day. We'll talk to you very soon. Bye for now.